The dust hung thick in the Red Mesa Community Hall as 64-year-old Clara Morgan sat quietly in her usual corner. Her weathered hands smoothed the simple brown dress she wore to town meetings. Around her, 43 voices fell silent mid-sentence, as if someone had suddenly muted the room. She hadn't spoken during the entire heated debate about Richard Blackwood's railroad contract. The Eastern businessmen had spent 2 hours presenting charts, financial projections, and promises of prosperity that would transform their frontier town into a modern hub of commerce. His confident voice had filled the room, punctuated by murmurs from men impressed by fancy words and bigger numbers. Blackwood had arrived 6 weeks earlier with Eastern money, legal documents, and the confidence of a man who had successfully developed dozens of frontier communities. His proposals promised jobs, growth, and modern conveniences that would put Red Mesa on the map. But nobody had made a decision. Nobody ever made important decisions in Red Mesa until Clara Morgan gave her opinion. It had been that way for so long that most residents couldn't remember when it started. They only knew that the quiet woman in the corner always knew what was best for their community. Judge Patterson, his white mustache trembling slightly with nervousness, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, his voice carrying the careful respect of a man who had learned over decades that this particular woman's thoughts carried unusual weight. "What do you think about Mr. Blackwood's proposal?" Richard Blackwood straightened his expensive suit jacket and smiled with the supreme confidence of a man who had bought and sold dozens of towns just like this one. At 45, he possessed everything he believed mattered in business: Eastern education, substantial capital, and the unshakable conviction that frontier communities were simply waiting for someone with vision to show them how to prosper properly. He had been working on Red Mesa for weeks, purchasing strategic properties and building political support for his development plans. The railroad contract he was proposing would give his company control over the town's future growth, channeling commerce through properties he owned and ensuring that the lion's share of profits flowed back to his investors in New York and Boston. Clara rose slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful despite her years. Her gray hair was pinned beneath a small hat adorned with a faded blue ribbon, the same ribbon she had worn to her first church service in Red Mesa 45 years earlier, when she was a terrified 19-year-old girl who owned nothing but the clothes on her back and a crumpled letter from a stranger. "The railroad will come through Miller's Creek, not Main Street," Clara said quietly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had never needed to shout to be heard. "Mr. Johnson will handle the contracts, not the Eastern Company. The matter is settled." Blackwood's confident smile faltered. "Now wait just a minute, ma'am. This decision affects the economic future of the entire territory. Surely we need to consider all the financial implications and—" Clara's pale blue eyes met his across the room, and something in that steady gaze made his prepared arguments crumble in his throat. She didn't interrupt him or raise her voice. She simply looked at him with the infinite patience of someone who had seen his type come and go for decades, each one certain that money and bluster could overcome the quiet bonds that held a real community together. "The matter is settled," Clara repeated, and sat back down. Around the room, papers rustled and chairs scraped as people prepared to leave. The meeting was over. Blackwood stared in disbelief as the most important business decision in recent memory was made by a woman who looked like she should be home tending her garden. But Richard Blackwood didn't know Clara's story. He didn't know that 45 years ago, she had arrived in Red Mesa as Clara Walsh, a desperate mail-order bride with no prospects beyond basic survival. He had no idea how that frightened girl had transformed herself into the most influential person in 3 counties, or that his own carefully laid plans had been doomed from the moment he dismissed her as irrelevant. If he had known Clara's real story, he never would have dared to challenge her. The story that would define Clara's legacy began 45 years earlier, on a scorching July morning in 1878. The westbound train pulled into Red Mesa Station an hour behind schedule, its engine gasping steam after the long mountain climb. Clara Elizabeth Walsh stepped carefully onto the weathered platform, her worn black boots touching frontier soil for the first time. At 19, everything about her spoke of careful economy and quiet desperation. The blue cotton dress mended twice with mismatched thread, the white collar yellowed despite repeated washing, and the way she carried herself with the careful posture of someone who had learned that drawing attention was rarely beneficial. Everything she owned fit in a single carpetbag that she clutched like armor. The bag had belonged to her mother, leather worn smooth, corners patched, brass clasp that no longer quite met. Inside were two additional dresses, mended undergarments, a small Bible, and a wooden comb that had been her only inheritance. More precious than any possession was the letter in her pocket, folded until the paper had worn soft as cloth. Written in careful script by Thomas Morgan, a widower rancher who had advertised for a wife to help raise his 3 children and manage his household. Clara had memorized every word during the journey west. Clara had answered his advertisement not from romance, but from grinding desperation. The textile mill in Lowell had closed. Her parents had died in the influenza epidemic, leaving her with debts and no prospects. The choices for young women in her situation were all variations of slow starvation or quick degradation. Marriage to a stranger was frightening, but it offered the only possibility of dignity and security. During the train journey, Clara had steeled herself for whatever lay ahead. She had survived her parents' death, the mill closure, and terrible uncertainty. She would survive this too, whatever it turned out to be. Thomas Morgan was waiting by the ticket office, exactly as promised. Clara recognized him immediately, tall and lean, with kind blue eyes and work-roughened hands. His sandy hair was already thinning, despite his 32 years, and his face bore lines from squinting into desert sun. He wore clean but well-worn clothes, brown wool trousers mended at the knee, a faded blue shirt, and scuffed but maintained boots. Everything suggested competence and quiet strength. "Miss Walsh," he said, removing his hat politely, "welcome to Red Mesa. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. The enormity of marrying a stranger in this harsh place had hit her full force. Thomas sensed her discomfort. "The heat takes getting used to," he said diplomatically. "Let me get your bag, and we'll head to the ranch where it's cooler." During the wagon ride, Clara got her first real look at her new world. Red Mesa was smaller than imagined. Just a few dozen buildings around the train station, general store, saloon, and small white church. The desert stretched endlessly, broken by distant red rock formations that rose like ancient monuments. "It's not much to look at first," Thomas said, following her gaze, "but it grows on you. The land becomes part of you, if you let it." The Morgan Ranch appeared as they crested a low ridge. The buildings sat in a natural depression protected from wind, centered around a 2-story house that looked solid and well-maintained. There was a barn, chicken coop, several corrals, and a vegetable garden, showing evidence of a woman's care. The children waited in the yard. Michael, 8, serious and watchful with his father's blue eyes. Sarah, 6, blonde and shy, peeking from behind her father's legs. Johnny, 4, clutching a carved wooden horse with frank curiosity. "Children," Thomas said gently, "this is Miss Walsh. She's going to be staying with us." Clara knelt to their level, moving slowly. "I'm very pleased to meet you." Michael stepped forward with premature maturity. "Are you going to be our new mother?" "I hope I can be," Clara replied honestly. "But that's something we'll all have to decide together, isn't it?" Sarah smiled slightly and Johnny announced, "I'm hungry," effectively breaking the tension. That first evening, as Clara helped prepare a simple dinner of beans, cornbread, and preserved vegetables, she began to understand the true nature of the challenge she faced. This wasn't just about marrying a stranger or adapting to frontier life. She was being asked to step into the role of a woman who was still very much missed, to raise children who were still grieving, and to help maintain a home built by someone else's hands and dreams. After a brief wedding ceremony performed by the traveling preacher who happened to be passing through town that week, Clara lay awake in the small room Thomas had prepared for her. He had been considerate enough to give her time to adjust to her new circumstances, and she was grateful for his patience and thoughtfulness. Through the thin walls, she could hear him moving around in his own room, probably lying awake with his own complicated mixture of hope, uncertainty, and grief for the wife he had loved and lost. She listened to the children's quiet breathing and the night sounds of her new world. Coyotes calling in the distance, wind rustling through desert vegetation, and the occasional lowing of cattle. The early weeks tested every assumption Clara had ever made about her own capabilities. She learned to milk cows, bake bread in a temperamental wood-burning stove, and manage the endless physical labor that frontier life demanded. Her hands became calloused, her back ached constantly, and the desert sun burned her fair skin, despite the bonnets and long sleeves she wore religiously. But as she adapted to the physical demands of her new life, something more important began to happen. Clara started to observe the social dynamics that governed life in Red Mesa, and she discovered that the official power structure was only part of a much more complex story. The bank president, Jonas Wheeler, might make final decisions about loans, but his wife Martha had considerable influence over which applications received favorable consideration. Store owner Henry Patterson controlled the flow of goods and credit, but his wife Elizabeth often decided which customers got priority when supplies were scarce. Most fascinating of all, Clara learned that the women of Red Mesa had developed an intricate informal network for managing community affairs. They shared information, coordinated resources, and solved problems through subtle signals and unspoken agreements that operated entirely beneath the surface of official business. At her first church social, Clara witnessed this network in action. The women gathered ostensibly to plan a fundraising effort, but the real business had nothing to do with church finances. Martha Wheeler mentioned that Jonas was considering a loan to a new merchant from Denver. Elizabeth Patterson noted that Henry had concerns about the merchant's ordering patterns. Agnes Morrison added that her husband had treated several people who mentioned the merchant's unusually detailed questions about local finances. Within an hour, without a single direct accusation, the women had reached consensus. The merchant was probably a confidence man who should be discouraged. By the following week, the man had decided Red Mesa didn't offer the opportunities he was seeking and moved on. Clara watched this process with growing fascination. These women were protecting their community through careful intelligence sharing and coordinated response to threats. They did it in ways that allowed their husbands to believe they were making independent decisions based on their own judgment. It was a revelation that would shape Clara's entire approach to frontier life. By her second year in Red Mesa, Clara had begun understanding that survival required more than physical adaptation. It demanded social integration. She systematically learned every detail of the community's ecosystem, discovering who owed whom favors, which families struggled financially, and how the intricate web of relationships actually functioned. Clara discovered that banker Jonas Wheeler had a gambling weakness that occasionally put him in difficult positions. She learned that store owner Henry Patterson was secretly courting Mary Collins, whose husband traveled frequently. She found out that the respected doctors sometimes watered down medicines to stretch supplies, understandable given supply difficulties, but potentially dangerous. Rather than using this information for personal advantage, Clara began offering quiet help where needed. When Jonas Wheeler's gambling losses threatened his family's security, Clara arranged for Thomas to make strategic deposits that gave the bank breathing room while allowing Jonas time to recover. When Henry Patterson's romantic situation nearly became public, Clara ensured Mary Collins received anonymous warning that allowed her to end it discreetly before it destroyed both families. People began noticing that problems had a way of resolving themselves when Clara Morgan was around. They didn't always understand how, but they started seeking her quiet counsel when difficulties arose. A casual conversation with Clara over coffee might lead to insights that help navigate business disputes. A brief discussion while hanging laundry might provide perspective on family conflicts. A few words after church might offer direction when important decisions needed making. The children, meanwhile, had come to see Clara not as their father's wife, but as their mother in every way that mattered. When 8-year-old Michael broke his arm falling from the oak tree, Clara stayed by his bedside for 3 days straight, reading to him and helping him manage pain and frustration. When 6-year-old Sarah was being bullied by older children, Clara somehow ensured the problem stopped without dramatic confrontations that might have embarrassed Sarah. When 4-year-old Johnny had nightmares after hearing scary stories, Clara rocked him to sleep every night for weeks while singing lullabies her own mother had used. Thomas, watching his wife's relationship with his children and her growing influence in the community, fell deeply in love with the quiet, observant woman who had transformed his house into a home. Their marriage had begun as practical arrangement, but it had grown into something genuine and profound. He never fully understood how Clara managed to anticipate problems before they happened, or how she seemed to know exactly what everyone in town needed. But he trusted her judgment completely. Within an hour, without a single direct accusation, the women had reached a consensus. The merchant was probably a confidence man, and he should be discouraged from establishing himself in Red Mesa. By the following week, the man had decided that the town didn't offer the opportunities he was seeking, and he moved on. Clara watched this process with growing fascination and understanding. These women were protecting their community through careful intelligence sharing and coordinated response to threats. And they did it in ways that allowed their husbands to believe they were making independent decisions based on their own judgment. It was a revelation that would shape Clara's entire approach to frontier life. By her second year in Red Mesa, Clara had begun to understand that survival required more than physical adaptation. It demanded social integration. She set about systematically learning every detail of the community's social ecosystem, discovering who owed whom favors, which families were struggling financially, and how the intricate web of relationships and obligations actually functioned. Rather than using this information for personal advantage, Clara began offering quiet help where it was needed. When banker Jonas Wheeler's occasional gambling losses threatened his family's security, Clara arranged for Thomas to make strategic deposits that gave the bank breathing room. When store owner Henry Patterson's romantic entanglements threatened to become public, Clara ensured that the situation was resolved discreetly before it could damage anyone's reputation. People began to notice that problems had a way of resolving themselves when Clara Morgan was around. They didn't always understand how or why, but they started seeking her counsel when difficulties arose. Clara's real education in community leadership came during the drought of 1883. When the rains failed and wells began going dry, the men of Red Mesa held increasingly desperate meetings about water rights and emergency measures. They were thinking in terms of individual survival, each family fighting for its own interests in a competition that could only end with winners and losers. Clara realized they were approaching the crisis entirely wrong. She understood that everyone would be stronger if they worked together, and that the drought could actually bring the community closer rather than tearing it apart. She began with quiet conversations, asking questions that led people to insights they thought were their own. Don't you think it would help if families with extra food could share with those who are struggling? I wonder if the children might be safer if they were cared for together, while the adults focus on emergency work. Within weeks, Red Mesa had transformed itself from a collection of desperate families into a coordinated survival network. Food was shared based on need rather than ability to pay. Water was distributed fairly. Children were cared for collectively. Tools and expertise were pooled strategically. The drought still hurt, but Red Mesa survived it better than any other town in the territory. When the rains finally returned, everyone understood that Clara Morgan had somehow been at the center of their salvation, though she had never given a direct order or claimed credit for any successful strategy. That was when Clara fully grasped the true nature of power in places like Red Mesa. Real influence came not from commanding people, but from understanding them so well that you could guide them toward decisions that benefited everyone while letting them believe those decisions were their own ideas. Over the following decades, Clara perfected this approach. She became the person everyone turned to for advice, the woman whose opinion carried weight in every important discussion. She never held official positions or made public speeches. She simply knew everyone, understood everything, and always seemed to suggest the right solution at the right time. By 1900, Red Mesa had grown from a struggling frontier settlement into a thriving town with sustainable prosperity. The railroad had come through, new businesses had opened, and the population had tripled. Clara was at the heart of all this development, though her role remained largely invisible. When statehood brought questions about political representation, Clara quietly orchestrated the election of David Sullivan, a young lawyer who had exactly the right combination of integrity and competence for the job. When conflicts arose over land use or water rights, Clara somehow facilitated solutions that satisfied everyone involved. When economic downturns threatened the community's stability, Clara helped coordinate responses that distributed the burden fairly while preserving hope for better times. The children had grown to see her as their mother in every way that mattered. Thomas had fallen deeply in love with the quiet, observant woman who had transformed his house into a home. The community prospered under her invisible guidance, developing a reputation for cooperation and problem-solving that was unusual even by frontier standards. Clara thought she had seen every challenge frontier life could offer. Then Richard Blackwood arrived. Blackwood came to Red Mesa in the spring of 1923 with Eastern money, grand plans, and absolute confidence that a man with his advantages could reshape any frontier community according to his vision of progress and profit. He began purchasing strategic properties, pushing through development plans that would benefit his investors, and making it clear that he intended to control Red Mesa's future growth. For the first time in 45 years, Clara faced a direct challenge to everything she had built. When Clara announced her decision about the railroad route in that town meeting, she wasn't simply expressing an opinion. She was activating a network of relationships and obligations that she had been building for nearly 5 decades. Jonas Wheeler held mortgages on most of the town's significant properties, and he remembered Clara's help during his family's crisis decades earlier. Henry Patterson controlled regional supply chains, and he had never forgotten Clara's discreet assistance during his personal troubles. Judge Patterson owed his political career to Clara's early support. Dr. Morrison's practice had flourished thanks to Clara's guidance in building community trust. Every person with real influence in Red Mesa owed Clara something, and she was finally calling in those debts. Over the following weeks, Blackwood discovered his plans crumbling through seemingly unrelated setbacks. The bank found irregularities in his loan documentation, requiring extensive review. Supply deliveries were mysteriously delayed by transportation problems and bureaucratic complications. Local workers found other employment opportunities. Government permits were held up by regulatory issues. The local newspaper began publishing articles about preserving Red Mesa's community character. Insurance companies discovered liability issues requiring higher premiums. Most frustratingly, Blackwood could never identify the source of his problems. Every obstacle appeared to result from normal business practices and regulatory requirements. Blackwood fought back desperately. He offered larger bribes but discovered Red Mesa's officials didn't operate that way. He threatened legal action but found his Eastern lawyers unfamiliar with territorial regulations. He tried bringing political pressure from the state capital but learned Red Mesa's representatives were immune to outside influence when protecting community interests. The breaking point came when Blackwood made his fatal error, confronting Clara directly. He had finally realized the elderly woman was connected to his setbacks, though he didn't understand her influence. On a Sunday morning after church, he approached her with confident authority, timing his offer for maximum public impact. "Mrs. Morgan," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I think there's been a misunderstanding between us. I'm prepared to make you a very generous personal offer if you'll reconsider your opposition to progress in Red Mesa." Conversation stopped. Every person turned to watch this significant moment. Clara looked at him with patient calmness, dressed in her usual simple church dress. "Mr. Blackwood," Clara said quietly, "I think you misunderstand how things work here." "I understand perfectly," Blackwood replied confidently. "Everyone has a price. I'm simply trying to find yours. I'm prepared to be quite generous." Clara smiled gently, conveying both amusement and pity. "Mr. Blackwood," she said now with steel in her voice, "the price for Red Mesa isn't mine to set. It belongs to the people who built it." She turned to the gathering crowd. "Mr. Blackwood seems to think our town is for sale. Perhaps we should vote on his offer." Every hand rose against Blackwood's proposal. Adults who remembered Clara's decades of service, young people who had grown up in her community, even some outside workers Blackwood had hired. The unanimous rejection was overwhelming and complete. Within a month, Blackwood was gone. His company withdrew, selling holdings at a loss to local buyers. His modernization plans were abandoned, replaced by locally developed initiatives serving actual community needs. The railroad came through Miller's Creek exactly as Clara suggested, bringing prosperity while preserving Red Mesa's character. Local contractors, suppliers, and workers handled everything, keeping economic benefits within the community. That evening, as Clara sat in her kitchen watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from that terrified 19-year-old girl clutching a carpetbag on a dusty train platform, to the woman who had just saved her community from destruction. The kitchen where she sat had been the heart of her family's life for 45 years. The wooden table bore the marks of countless meals shared with Thomas and the children, homework sessions that stretched late into the evening, and quiet conversations that had helped solve both family problems and community challenges. The chairs around the table had been occupied by three generations of visitors who had come seeking advice, comfort, or simply the pleasure of Clara's company. She thought about Thomas, who had died peacefully 5 years earlier after a brief illness, surrounded by the family that had grown far beyond anything either of them had dared hope for when they first met at that dusty train station. Their marriage had begun as a practical arrangement between strangers, but it had grown into something profound and lasting, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the deep satisfaction that came from building something meaningful together. Thomas had never fully understood how Clara managed to anticipate problems before they happened, or how she always seemed to know exactly what everyone in town needed, but he had learned to trust her judgment completely. When Clara suggested they invite certain neighbors for dinner, Thomas discovered those gatherings somehow helped resolve disputes or forge new business relationships. When she recommended specific workers for ranch projects, those men invariably proved to be exactly the right choice. When Clara mentioned that certain families might benefit from particular forms of assistance, Thomas found that helping them usually resulted in unexpected benefits for his own family. She thought about Michael, who had grown from that serious 8-year-old boy into a successful rancher, managing not only his father's original land, but additional property he had acquired through his own hard work and careful planning. He had married Rebecca Sullivan, David's younger sister, and together they had raised 4 children who were now adults themselves. More importantly, Michael had absorbed Clara's lessons about building relationships based on trust and mutual benefit rather than competition and conflict. His ranch was known throughout the territory for fair dealing with neighbors, generous treatment of workers, and innovative approaches to land and water management that benefited the entire region. Sarah had grown from a shy 6-year-old into a confident woman who had married Dr. Morrison's son and moved to the state capital, where she had become active in women's education initiatives and territorial politics. Sarah's letters, which arrived regularly, described work that was clearly influenced by Clara's example of quiet leadership and service to community needs. She had organized schools for children whose families couldn't afford private education, founded charitable organizations that provided assistance to families in crisis, and become one of the most respected women in territorial society. Sarah's approach to politics was exactly what Clara would have expected. She worked behind the scenes to build coalitions and find solutions that served everyone's interests rather than seeking public recognition or personal advancement. Johnny had grown from a curious 4-year-old into a thoughtful young man who had opened his own law practice in partnership with David Sullivan. He combined his legal training with the negotiation skills and deep understanding of human nature he had absorbed from growing up in Clara's household. Johnny had never married, preferring to dedicate himself to legal work that served the community's needs rather than pursuing personal wealth or political ambition. His practice specialized in helping families resolve disputes, assisting new businesses navigate regulatory requirements, and ensuring that development projects serve community interests rather than just investors' profits. All 3 children wrote to her regularly, seeking her counsel on everything from business decisions to child-rearing challenges. Their letters showed how thoroughly they had internalized the lessons she had taught them about the importance of community, the value of patient observation, and the power of working with people rather than against them. Most of all, she thought about the lessons she had learned during those first desperate weeks in Red Mesa, when she had been forced to choose between simply surviving and truly living. Real strength, she had discovered, came not from fighting for what you wanted, but from helping others get what they needed. It was a lesson that had guided every significant decision she had made for 45 years, and it had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. The community that had grown up around Clara's quiet leadership was now a model for successful frontier development. Red Mesa was frequently cited by territorial officials as an example of how frontier settlements could thrive through cooperation rather than conflict. Visitors often commented on the town's unusual atmosphere of mutual respect and shared purpose. though they rarely understood the quiet leadership that had made it possible. When traveling merchants came through Red Mesa, they were often surprised by how smoothly business transactions proceeded. Disputes that might have led to violence in other towns were resolved through mediation and compromise. Contracts were honored not because of legal enforcement, but because violating them would damage relationships that people valued. New businesses were welcomed and supported rather than seen as threats to existing enterprises. When territorial officials visited Red Mesa to study its development, they found a community that had somehow managed to grow and prosper while maintaining the kind of social cohesion that usually disappeared as towns became larger and more complex. They saw a place where longtime residents and newcomers worked together effectively, where different ethnic and economic groups found ways to cooperate rather than compete, and where conflicts were resolved through discussion rather than force. Clara had played a central role in creating this culture, but she had done it so quietly and effectively that most people took it for granted. The cooperative spirit, the mutual support, and the collaborative problem-solving that characterized Red Mesa weren't seen as unusual achievements. They were simply the way things worked in a well-functioning community. At 64, Clara Morgan was still making decisions that shaped the future of Red Mesa. The railroad contract she had influenced would bring new opportunities and challenges that would require the same careful attention to community welfare that had guided her for nearly 5 decades. The next generation of community leaders she had helped train, including several young women who had been watching and learning from her example, were ready to take on greater responsibilities as she gradually stepped back from her most active role. But Clara's real legacy wasn't in any specific decision or particular achievement. It was in the culture of cooperation, mutual respect, and collective responsibility that she had helped create in Red Mesa. It was in the understanding that true progress came through working together rather than competing against each other, that real prosperity included everyone, rather than just a privileged few, and that lasting strength grew from community bonds rather than individual power. The frightened girl who had stepped off the train in 1878 with nothing to offer but her willingness to work and learn had become the woman whose quiet voice carried more authority than any amount of wealth, political position, or outside pressure could command. She had proven that the most powerful force in any community was the steady dedication of someone who truly cared about the common good. Clara Morgan had arrived in Red Mesa as a mail-order bride with no power, no influence, and no prospects beyond the hope of basic survival. She would always be remembered as the woman who taught an entire community that real leadership meant service, that true authority came from trust, and that the greatest victory was not in defeating your enemies, but in helping your neighbors become the best versions of themselves. And in a world that often valued loudness over wisdom, force over patience, and individual success over collective prosperity, Clara's quiet triumph stood as lasting proof that there was another way, a better way, for people to live together and build something worth keeping. The transformation was complete. The mail-order bride had become a queen, not through conquest or inheritance, but through 45 years of patient service to something larger than herself. Her kingdom was built not of territory conquered, but of relationships nurtured, not of subjects ruled, but of neighbors served, not of power imposed, but of trust earned through decades of quiet dedication to the common good.